We're talking about rights this morning. There have been too many a conversation around what is happening and how people have disappeared. We don't know what's going on with them. That somebody can open their mouth on what is new media today, social media, in whatever shape or form that takes, and then they don't know if they're going to wake up tomorrow morning. We saw the devastating position of a young woman last week who is a big social media blogger. She made a post last week, or the week before last, and then she disappeared for 4 days and then showed up with severe bodily harm and, terrible injuries. And the question is, where are our rights? And that's the conversation that we have this morning. Kenya at crossroads on its human rights situation. Wallace Nderu is here with us, and he is the research and advocacy advisor for the Defenders Coalition. Wallace, a happy situation room welcome to you.
Thank you very much for having me here this morning. Very grateful to be part of this conversation, which is very important and pertinent. As you highlighted earlier, we have a crisis, so to speak, in this country in terms of human rights violations and freedoms. So glad to be here to have this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for honoring that invitation. And even as we do, CT Muga goes around the continent every week. He comes in, as you must know, with a proverb from a different country.
Yes, he does.
And he's going to share where we are this week, and he'll share the proverb, and of course we'll ask you to interpret that.
Oh, great.
Okay.
Hi. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Super.
Great.
Yes.
Great.
We are still in the Coup Belt, but this time around, the thing I want to point out is we are in the Sahel. Now, the Sahel region in this continent refers to a place which, if you're polite, you'd say it's semi-arid. If you're to be honest, you'd say it's predominantly arid. And the country from whence we get our proverb this week are in that region. Close to 90% of the land mass is part of the Sahara Desert. Nonetheless, it is a country rich in minerals. Rich. It's a country rich in culture. It has an interesting mixture of Berber and Arab communities who intermarried. They formed communities that, as I said, very unique. But apart from just being in the Coup Belt, it also represents the tragedy of Africa in the sense that African countries are rich in minerals and it has some of the poorest people on the planet. This country is one of the poorest countries on the continent. And if you're one of the poorest countries in the continent, you're also one of the poorest countries in the world. They are poor countries, but we do well with our poverty. We rank very, very highly in our poverty. It's the 11th largest country in Africa and 28th largest country in the world. Population isn't that big, just around 4.3 million. The proverb: if you watch your pot, your food will not burn. Now, I clarified in the previous hour that the pot I refer to here is not your belly. I am referring to the cooking vessel. Yes, if you watch it, your food will not burn. What do you think of the proverb and what do you think it means?
I think to me it means that if you are wary of a situation, you can be able to say, for example, be averting a disaster, for example. If I give it, this can apply, of course, in our daily lives, where we are conscious of our environments, we are conscious of our surroundings. So in that particular scenario, then if anything was to happen, you'll be able to respond very quickly. Because when you're cooking, mostly we just, especially tea, for example, if you just turn away for a minute, for a second, it will boil over and spill. But if you're looking at that particular tea, cooking all through, it will not spill, it will not spill over. So I think for me, the proverb means that we need to be very aware of our situations, aware of our circumstances, and be able to take appropriate actions where necessary.
It's interesting when you talk about milk and water and tea, because water on its own will bubble and boil, but it won't really spill.
No.
But you put tea leaves, spills. You add milk, it spills. But your point is very well made. Thank you.
Indeed.
Yes, thank you
it is
much.
quite. So, there are too many stories in 2025, I mean, I'm not even going to talk about 2024 and beyond that.
Yeah.
Already in 2025, we're in the third month of the year, and there are too many stories about folks who've opened their mouth to then be able to express themselves freely, and then have either died or disappeared. That's the thing.
Yeah.
That there are people. Too many, and in my opinion, one is too many.
One is too many.
One is too many of an individual who says something and then turns up, beaten within an inch of their life, or that actually died.
Yeah.
And this is where we are. Are we at a crossroads when it comes to the human rights situation in the country? And I'm going to also then point out the fact that, you had visiting royals last week who made statements, and one of the things that they did bring out was human rights.
Yeah.
So where is Kenya with the human rights situation today?
Thank you very much. So where we are right now currently in this country, in terms of human rights, we are doing poorly. We're doing terribly. We are not adhering to our constitution, which provides for our rights in Chapter 4. We are not adhering to a lot of regional, international instruments which we ratified as a country. And the reason why we can say Kenya is at a crossroads is, one, Kenya is currently an elected member of the Human Rights Council, and they'll be in the council for the next 3 years. And the reason why we're saying we're at a crossroads is because now Kenya has to make a very important decision regarding human rights situation internally. And when we do an introspection of ourselves, we'll be able to appreciate that we are not doing well. One of the criterias which are usually used by the General Assembly during the election of members to the Human Rights Council, they usually elect from the 195 members of the UN. They usually look into the candidate's, human rights track record and his commitment to human rights. And so if we're being very honest, and when Kenya came up for candidature and was elected to the council, then the question will be, did they actually look into the country's human rights situation? Have we actually made commitments to safeguard rights and freedoms in this country? And have we taken appropriate measures to do so? The answer to that question to me will be a no, because when you look at what has been highlighted just earlier on during the commencement of this conversation, we appreciate we're doing very poorly. When you have people being disappeared, their rights are being violated. When you have people's bodies being found in thickets and bushes and rivers, people's rights are being violated. So as a country, we cannot be then the ones to be mandated to promote human rights on a global scale while we ourselves are doing significantly very poorly. And that's the challenge that we have. So the crossroads is Kenya ready and willing, being on the seat of the council, to be able now to right its wrong in terms of ensuring rights are safeguarded, freedoms are ensured, and Kenyans can actually be able to exist in a space where they don't have any fear. Posting on social media right now, for example, leads to a violation of the right to expression, but also it leads to another, violation of other rights. Article 29 talks about you cannot, freedom from torture, inhumane, degrading treatment, and how many of these Kenyans are actually going through that? The lady you mentioned earlier, Article 29 for her clearly was violated beyond the other articles we could make reference to. So Kenya has to make a decision. That's why we're at a crossroads in terms of, are we now ready to do a proper introspection of ourselves? Are we ready to call ourselves for a small meeting like we usually say and appreciate where we are in terms of our human rights track record? Are we doing well? And if we're not doing well, how can we better it?
Can I ask this question?
Yes.
Human rights, there is clearly a bar that we use to measure.
Yes.
And that bar is what leads us to look at the track record of a country as represented by the people in leadership. That brings us to the word crisis. So human rights and the progression towards achieving it is aspirational.
Yes.
Okay, now, what measure then do we use when we say we are in a crisis? Because I'm asking this question in this respect. Even as we look at rights of individuals being abrogated, what about the freedoms that people still have despite? Because if you give the example of our country, one could argue that it's in the attempt to express these freedoms that we see the abrogation of the same freedoms. And so on a scale of 1 to 10, if you look at, if I can give it a quantum, the expressions that we see of freedoms of right from different players vis-a-vis the negative response and reaction that amounts to a violation of these rights, which one weighs heavier?
No, I think that's a very good question, because then when it comes to human rights and fundamental freedoms, right, the measure usually is how well are they being implemented in the country, and especially when it comes to progression and applicability of that mostly will be for socio-economic rights, and that's why we appreciate they usually implement it progressively. But again, also the question then will be, you may have it on paper, but how is it effective in your country? And I'm positive right now, if we were to take the Constitution and go article per article, we'll be able to appreciate the violations that occur in it, right? You have laws in place, you have a constitution in place, you have treaties and regional instruments, and you have ratified. Then the question is, are the people in your country being able to enjoy these rights fully? That would be one. Secondly, and if there is any violation of these particular rights, are there any redress mechanisms to be able to address these particular rights? And if there are none, then, or probably they are very limited, then the concern will be, then we can say there's a very serious situation in that particular country regarding human rights. When you look at how countries are categorized in terms of enjoyment of rights, Kenya is categorized as obstructed in terms of people being able to enjoy their rights and freedoms. Obstructed, why? Because you have in place, our constitution it's deemed to be one of the most progressive ones in the continent, right? And Chapter 4 is very clear. But now there are very many blockades along the way, which will now bar Kenyans from being able to enjoy these rights and freedoms. So in as much as we have rights, the question then will be, are people enjoying them? That's the question. And if they are they doing it fully? And if they are doing it fully, then we are good to go. But every single time we are going to be looking at the country itself, and reports will be made, right? If we go, for example, to the Kenya National Commission Human Rights website, we'll be able to get a lot of reports which document violation of rights and freedoms of people. So to answer your question is, they are there, yes, but are they being enjoyed fully by the people? And if the answer is in the negative, then that's a situation we need to be able to address holistically.
So the situation that you speak to pretty much is where the constitution of the land gives the populace rights, those that they should enjoy, rightfully so. But then again, there is now the implementation aspect of these rights and making sure that they citizens operate in them and enjoy them is where the problem is at. Because if we talk about freedom to expression, that is a right given by the Constitution. But when you say so it is the implementing body in making sure that these rights are enjoyed that is failing at it. So then if that is the situation, we know that is the problem. What needs to be done? And from the Defenders Coalition, part of this civil rights group, what is the conversation that perhaps you're having, and what has been the response?
So one of the things we are right in terms of implementation, right? And of course, the duty of this, ensuring these rights are safeguarded is usually to the state, and then the state will trickle it down to the other organs which will work with to ensure that these rights are actually safeguarded. But again, also what we're doing in terms of ensuring these rights and freedoms are safeguarded is doing a lot of advocacy around ensuring that, one, there's accountability for violation of rights and freedoms. We appreciate that we fall short in terms of accountability, and a good example is what happened last year during the protests. We have not seen people being held accountable for their action, especially for questions on police brutality, as well as people who sustain a lot of injuries, people who are killed. The other thing we look at is, do we have we push for the strengthening of existing mechanisms to be able to be utilized for defend these rights, right? When you talk about institutions in place, are they effective? For example, are they do they have the adequate resources to be able to ensure that these rights are protected? So most of the time, you'll find civil society, like Defenders Coalition, will be pushing to ensure that if it's funding, it's adequate. For example, the Kenya National Commission of Human Rights, do they have the requisite resources, and especially both financial and human, to be able to ensure that, given their task of ensuring the safeguard and protection of this particular rights in this country, is it happening? When you look, for example, at IPOA, for instance, they're supposed to be investigating a lot of all this issue we talk about police brutality. Do they have the resources to do it? And so for us, it's basically to call out the government, most especially, to be able to ensure that these particular institutions, this particular organizations, so to speak, are adequately funded. Because when they're weakened, then at the end of the day, violations will occur, and the redress will be very minimal and near zero. What else we do is we utilize not only national spaces, including courts if we need to, but also utilize regional and international mechanisms. Regional being especially the African Commission of Human and People's Rights. I usually have ordinary sessions through the entire year. For this year, they'll have 4 sessions, right? So, and especially for civil society, utilize this space now to be able to clearly highlight the human rights situations in the country, right? When you go to the commission and then you present your statement, the statement can be adopted and recommendations made. Last year, unfortunately, during the commission sessions, we ourselves had been present at the commission sessions and wrote a very clear statement of the situation of human rights in the country. Unfortunately, but of course the commission cannot be compelled, they did not pick up the recommendations, and appreciating the situation Kenya was in last year between, remember, in March with the floods, and then what that translated to in terms of other socio-economic rights, and then also the issues of enforced disappearance, extrajudicial and abductions. We can utilize international spaces, and the Universal Periodic Review before the Human Rights Council is another thing that is actually very important. Kenya is coming up for review this year in May. Before the Human Rights Council, despite it being a member of the Human Rights Council. And so that also presents an opportunity for civil society organizations, especially during the pre-sessions, usually take place a month, at least two months before the actual review is actually conducted, to be able to also paint a very clear picture of the human rights situation in the country. When the country itself, when they do their state reports and you read that state report, you might think you live in a utopia. Everything seems to be working, we're putting in place these policies, we're putting in place these particular measures, and then tomorrow you wake up, everything will be okay. But that's not the actual situation. So we have to utilize all these spaces, all these mechanisms, because at the end of the day, when it comes to advocacy, it's driving change, and we believe change is achievable.
I mean, Wallace, it will sound crazy, but I think that, and you can stop me if I'm wrong, but a lot of organizations that operate in this space, and I think it's beyond dealing with a resource issue. If you want to look at IPOA, for example, give me one example. We can talk about resources until the cows come home. But give me one example over the last 10 years where a case has been prosecuted, where an officer, for example, has been brutal against a citizen, and all the evidence is pointing, but one case where this has happened, 2 cases, 3 cases where this has happened, and with regularity. So I almost refuse to imagine that it is a resource issue beyond a goodwill issue. When we talk about dealing with rights, it's not as though we're dealing with your food and bread and butter situation. So do we have a resource issue when it comes to dealing with human rights? Or do we have a desire and will issue when it comes to dealing with human rights?
I agree. I will agree and say it's to me it's both, right? And of course, goodwill is very important, because when you have laws in place, for example, then it will be the goodwill of say, for example, if it's the nation to be able to, the state, for example, to ensure that these particular rights are safeguarded. But it's a resource issue as well, because when we look at, for example, IPOA, and I'm not here to vouch for them, but to answer your question, they're supposed equally to carry out investigations, and especially when it comes to issues of police conduct and misconduct. And then you find they always they are not adequately funded. Then that would hinder the operations. But also beyond the resources, then it will be how then can they continue to operate, ensure that they safeguard these rights beyond resources.
Sorry, can I interject?
Yeah.
And that's why I'm insisting that it is a goodwill issue. Because if you set up IPOA, you set up the independent policing authority, and then you don't fund it.
Yes.
Not because you cannot, but that you do not.
Exactly.
That to me is that you're actually not interested in making sure that police officers actually don't abrogate the rights of Kenyans. Because if you were, then you would fund it. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's not a resource issue.
Exactly.
It's a goodwill issue from that level.
Exactly.
Whereby you have an entire authority that has been set up. It doesn't do Squidly did to make sure that this thing is actually done.
It's what I spoke about earlier in terms of weakening, institutions, and that's one of the ways they actually do it. So you find the institution is well set up, as statutorily and everything else. But then, of course, at the state level, that's where the goodwill comes in. Because, and I agree with you, if you are deliberate about ensuring that human rights and freedoms in your country are safeguarded, one of the things that you need to do is ensure that all these institutions and mechanisms available are adequately resourced to ensure that they can be able to issue redresses where violations occur. Goodwill also will come in the part of ensuring that beyond the resourcing and all the required measures are to be taken to ensure that they function adequately. So the issue of Goodwill, now we'll trickle back to what I talked about, weekend institutions, and they're very deliberate about it, and I'll agree with you, it's very deliberate, because if even if you take an example, for example, you have a company and you have people who are working there and you're not paying them adequately, probably you refused to withhold the salary for a very long time, they will not function as they're supposed to function. Right? So it's the same thing with these institutions. If they're adequately resourced and you actually give them the proper leeway to be able to do their work very well, we'll not be having this conversation. And I agree with you. It's an issue of goodwill. And then when you come now to the prosecution aspect of it as well, it's unless a case is really, really pushed, and especially when it comes to police brutality, you find they don't go anywhere. And a good example is for the late Willie Kimani. It took effort from civil society, Law Society of Kenya, to actually see that these particular police officers were found guilty and were sentenced. But how many other Kenyans are brutalized and cannot be able to access these remedies? How many will be able to go to, say, for example, come to us as a coalition or go to LSK and say, our rights were violated, how can we be redressed? And you'll be surprised when you interact with, Kenyans, ordinary Kenyans day to day, they'll tell you their rights were violated, especially each and every Kenyan can tell you of a right which was violated to them, but with no redress, right? So are there structures in place? They are. Do we have adequate, is there goodwill to have them functioning properly? No, there isn't. And the Kenya National Commission, for example, as a mechanism, and its core mandate is to ensure that the rights and freedoms are safeguarded. And they'll tell you every single day when a new budget is being read, their fund is reduced.
Okay.
What does that mean to the commission? They'll try their best. But again, also we have to go back to appreciating that they need to be.
It's not a priority.
To them, it's not a priority.
Can the citizens play any role?
Yes.
In getting this well upped? Because right now, from the way we're going about our discussion, it's at rock bottom. How, if they can, would the citizens play a role? Because the rights we speak of are the rights of the citizens.
Yeah.
So how do citizens understand, and with the understanding act upon, ensuring that institutions that are set up for their benefit, because this is what it is for, actually get the requisite support? Because again, the support comes from their money, their taxes. Can citizens actually move this needle? Because right now it's not just stuck, it's on a downward movement. Can citizens help?
I think they really can. And I think one of the ways we can be able to engage the citizens to be able to take up this is we need to be able to have adequate civic education in this country.
Right.
And you'll be able to appreciate a lot of Kenyans do not appreciate even this mechanism exist and what they exist for. It is only when somebody is faced with an issue that they'll come to appreciate the Kenya National Commission, for example, or IPOA, or even any other organization that is mandated to safeguard their rights and freedoms. And so after they're adequately engaged, and this can be through baras, this can be through forums where each and every day have a conversation about it.
Yeah.
Once you have people who have adequate information about their rights and freedoms, and then you'll be able to tell them about the mechanisms that are in existence and how can this actually happen.
So then the question is, you're educated, you have the information,
but
you know
we're educated. How do you determine that people are educated? How do you know
that they've gotten enough information and now they know?
Because the thing about education, before it can be manifest, you cannot say somebody is educated. It can be informed. Yes, but when someone is educated, the education manifests in the person. So,
as well as we just have that conversation, there is also the aspect of, when we talk about human rights, there is the aspect of the government implementing the same. And the citizenry as well, understanding their role in making sure that human rights are equally upheld, because you find that the citizens themselves are allowed to be used. So in terms of education and, as City says, determining that they're educated, there is a disconnect.
Yeah, I think that's why I mentioned it. We're using the term civic education, but of course its purpose is to be able to impart information, and we appreciate this information. Of course, cannot be able to impart it. All of it all at once, right? But we appreciate if somebody has a know-how of a particular thing, then it becomes a bit easier to be able to navigate through it. Then that might lead to people wanting to get more information about something. So if and especially you'll be surprised, Kenyans out here want to be informed, right? And you'll find people stopping you even on the way and asking you, there's this thing they said on TV about A, B, C, D. What does that even mean? They may not go into the depth of it, for example, to be able to be, like you mentioned, properly educated. And I agree with you, there's no that proper measure to say this particular person is educated, this particular person is educated. But having that information is very, very important, because that information now will be, we believe, will create a spiral effect where it's going to be now snowballing of you'd want to know more and more and more. And a good example is during last year's protest, Kenyans who thought were not aware of their rights were now, being found in situations where they want to know more about something, and you could see advocates going online or people with that particular information sharing it, in bits for them to be able to appreciate. So what happens after this? So information is very important, and for me, information is power.
Yeah.
We may talk about civic education because that's the term usually used mostly in this particular space, but it's all about sharing information, and it's relevant information, not just information for the sake of sharing information. And so once we appreciate when they have this information, how then do they use it is a question, right? You now have an informed people. So these are people who are going to be able to appreciate when rights are being, when things are not working, when things are going wrong. If it's a right that is being violated, how is it being violated, and who is violating it, and what's the redress mechanism? If it's these institutions, how then can we galvanize ourselves together to be able to ensure that this particular institutions are adequately resourced to be able to work?
When you educate or when you pass on knowledge, for instance, do we tell our citizenry that when you fight for your rights, you will be fought back?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me take you back to the time when we had a president called Daniel Arap Moi. It was a single party state then. And there were people who opposed that party directly.
Yes.
And some of them they were members of the party because there was only one party anyway.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, what they stood for were the very things you're talking about. Rights. Not very popular then. But what was the demonstration that people had understood? They kept being voted in. So their people had understood what these people are doing makes perfect sense, and we will support it. Okay?
Yeah.
When we look at June 25th, a watershed moment for this country, the Gen Z had got it.
Yes.
They had actually got it. They had understood, our rights are being violated here. And these old fogies don't seem to be doing anything about it.
Yeah.
So let's
show them a thing or two.
Let's make a statement or so. They understood it over time.
Yeah.
Now, that was the beginning of them understanding what their power citizens are.
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah.
Now, when we continue with this, I'm still stuck on that knowledge and education. See, there is knowledge which brings you power.
Yeah.
And then with power comes responsibility.
Definitely.
Okay?
Yeah.
Because sometimes this is lost.
Yeah.
And the quarrel we tend to have with those in leadership and power is that this responsibility bit, they don't seem to get. Yes.
Unfortunately.
We give you our money and you just do what you like with it. And we're telling you, we want you to do this. This is what we agreed we would do.
Yeah.
The nexus. How do you get, because a government that is willing to set up institutions like the National Human Rights Commission, it tells you they have gotten part of the message. That's why they've set it up. And once it's set up, it's there.
Yeah.
Okay? How do we get these institutions which you've said we have to actually be active? How do we breathe life into it? Because whether it is IPOA, when they do what they're supposed to do, the changes we talk about will actually become manifest. How do we get them to do what they're supposed to do?
Yeah. It's a very good question, because when we, and I agree, but also with in terms of information, and we usually want to push for where we ensure things are done and done in the rightful manner, including being able to utilize the mechanisms we have and the laws that we have, for example. And even last year, the Gen Z's protest was them exercising their right as provided for in the Constitution. But even if you're going to, take that route, for example, we have to do it within the confines of the law. So, right? So everything that we do has to be within the confines of the law. As mentioned, also with responsibilities, not on, even we citizens have responsibilities ourselves in ensuring that even when we're enjoying these rights, they do not spill over to violate others as well. And the question about with this information, then once you appreciate, as I go into your question about how do we make these institutions work, is when people appreciate what mechanisms they have in place and how can people to utilize them is very, very important. And if it means civil action, then that be it. But we need to be able to, properly, address these issues head on.
I'm hearing you, but I'm at a crossroads here because usually we can draw from examples of other jurisdictions, and I remember the case that went crazy viral in the US was the Jimmy Floyd case, where the police officer essentially stepped on his neck and he died. Right? That happened. But where's the police officer today? He's in jail. Right? Because the system pushed for a situation where you cannot allow something like this to happen. So what happens as a result of that? That either it serves as a deterrent or it serves as a wake-up call for anybody else operating in the system who then will say, hang on a minute, it's not the right thing to do, but at the same time, if I do it, the chances of me landing in jail are very high. So that's what it does. When you have a situation whereby there is recourse for something that happens, whereby, and this is not passion, it is fact that young black men in the United States were usually having their rights abrogated by virtue of the fact of how they looked. And it went on for years. So it took a man to die, in this manner, for people to stand up and say, come on, we cannot allow this to continue because it's a young black man today, tomorrow it's a white young woman. So they said, you know what, we're not going to allow this to continue anymore. They were educated for years before that. They had the mechanisms, they had the authority, but it took somebody going to jail and serving a life, serving currently a long sentence for people to sit up and say, hang on a minute, we can't allow the status quo to happen. Now, if we want to come back here, I'm still looking for something whereby we have so many human rights organizations who operate. We have people who do civic education. We have people who are talking about it as long as the day is. But then we don't see that. What's the thing that happens? Sure, we do see that there's some police officers who've gone to jail for life because of things that they did to inmates. For example, there's a one famous Thika case. And also the Mlolongo case as well. We see that. But these things that we see, where even as late as yesterday, there are people who open their mouths and they say things and they're hurt in ways that are unimaginable, unspeakable, unthinkable. And we just say, oh yeah, we don't have the resources, we'll wait, maybe something. I mean, come on. How will we ever get past the crossroads if we're still dealing with, book and pen?
Exactly. And I totally agree, because that's what we're talking about when we do an introspection of ourselves, right?
George Floyd, sorry, his name was George Floyd.
Floyd. No, it's okay. When you do a proper introspection of ourselves, right, we are the ones who are supposed to make sure these systems do work, right? How do we navigate through the impunity, for example? Why would somebody violate a right and get away with it? And there are in place laws which can be utilized to be able to ensure that a particular person, does not go scot-free. But we've developed a culture, so to speak, where, and especially people in authority and power, will be able to do what they can and will do, violate a right and be on their way, right? So it's one upon us to be able to reverse this culture, so to speak, in terms of when you violate a right, you can actually be held accountable for that particular issue. And also for me, it's an accountability issue. Nobody wants to be held accountable for their misdoings, right? We find ways to navigate through situations and we emerge from the other end of it. If we develop a proper human rights culture in this particular country, where even the smallest of violations is actually, there is retribution for it, then things might change. But also appreciating that our country, like mentioned, we have a history of rights violations in this country. And also we have a history of where people are not, there's no retribution for people who commit these violations. So when that continues, it's perpetuated, even with the informed citizenry, then nothing might actually happen. You find, and especially for civil society organizations, they usually do the best that they can. Remembering, of course, with the state and its machinery in place, they can easily push you over. But we need to be able to have a change of culture, right? And when you talk about Kenya being a crossroads in human rights situation is that particular thing. Are we ready to make that change? Are we ready now, we are on the Human Rights Council, to be able to have a proper introspection of ourselves and say, all these things we've been doing, we can change them. How do we change them, for example? If we have this mechanism in place, like I mentioned, how do we make them work? And I agree, it's the goodwill of it. All these things will trickle down to goodwill. And the absence of goodwill, whether you have executive or judiciary or parliament, in its absence, it will not work. So how we ourselves now have to continue this conversation of how do we change the culture, where now we can be able to see things are happening.
Right.
And minus that, we're going to be having the same conversation of
You know what, listen, don't beat yourself too much. The progress we speak of in this country and the profundity of it speaks to the existence of an understanding of human rights and the need to have those rights applied. It is the reason why a conversation like this is actually taking place. Because there was a time you have this conversation, you're being waited for. Okay?
Waited for?
Yeah, so that
interrupt the conversation.
Yeah, so that you can be given a government scholarship.
Yeah. They wouldn't even wait for you to finish.
So the introspection and the need to be able to actually bring about change is necessary. You know, I'm going back to where I started.
Yes.
How do you get the citizenry to internalize this? And it can't be on the national level because that's too far-fetched. It is understanding it at the local level.
Yes.
We have an MCA whom we have elected.
Yes.
And this person, we never see them.
Yeah.
And the things they told us they'll do, they never do. MCA, somebody you can, ahead of Mjikumi, a local representative.
Nyumbakumi.
Yes. What do I call it?
Mijikumi.
Okay, thank you very much.
10 cities, opposed to 10 houses, but it's okay.
Yes. A leader, a religious leader whose pronounced beliefs and actions do not tally, and yet we have them. If at the local level we can take these people to task, one, with the purpose of correctiveness, because some people may need help, okay? But we understand what we can do. It is then easier to move that conversation to the constituency level. Much, much easier.
Yeah.
It is much, much easier than to take that to the county level. And the representatives who we have at the county level. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because any discussion that is supposed to have an impact has to start from the lowest possible common denominator.
Yeah.
If it gets there, and it often means working with groups who already do this, and they exist.
And they're pretty number.
So, looking at Kenya and looking at where we are, and looking at the problems that we have when it comes to human rights, bodies and institutions that are involved in this process, let's park IPOA aside and look at the police service. How does the communication on human rights involve and include the police service? Police service here is AP plus GSU. Okay?
Plus regular police.
Yes. How does this involve the judiciary? Because we adjudicate things which we have difficulty with the judiciary. How up to date are they? The fact that they adjudicate over the law doesn't mean that they practice it. Yeah. Well, their judgments tend to impact hugely on all these things that we do.
Yeah.
And it isn't when a human rights violation is brought to them. No. If it's an economic issue, it has human rights directly embedded in it. If it is an issue to do with communal property, it has human rights directly embedded in it.
Yeah.
How do these things play an important role, and how does it impact their decision-making process? Then let's come down to the dodo in the conversation, Parliament. How
Your favorite set of people. Yes.
my favorite test.
Yeah.
Set of people. How do we get to them? Because much as they're a despicable lot, the truth of the matter is that, okay, barring a few individuals here and there, who in numbers statistically are irrelevant, how do we get them? Because given the import of what they do, it impacts on our lives very, very directly. How do we get them to understand that the decisions they make have just about the most dire and impactful consequences on human lives in the country? How do we do this?
Yeah. I will start with with the communities, and like you mentioned, we have started the lowest denominator, and that's basically every Kenyan. And so as you mentioned, and I agree, we have quite a number of organizations, especially community-based organizations, community groups organizations, which work within the grassroots within the communities to ensure that the change starts there. And when we have that conversation at that particular juncture, and appreciating this is work which will be done over time, then we'll be able, like mentioned, to progress on progressively. So a lot of work is happening there. A lot of information sharing is happening within the communities, because once they appreciate, what can be done, what cannot be done, then they actually will be able to move forward, and we'll be able to move from one stature to the other. And I can confirm that we work with human rights defenders from across the country in all their diversity, and I can attest to the fact that they are very busy, in the grounds, their communities, engaging diverse people, whether it's community leaders, whether it's cultural leaders, for example, to be able to ensure that this conversation is being had and continues. And that's very important. So once that happens, then you can be able now to continue elevating up all the way to the highest level. When you now bring in other stakeholders in place, and of course now arms of government, then the conversation, of course, will still continue. And for Parliament, both whether it's the Senate or the National Assembly, and one of the ways we found to engage them, unfortunately, is you have now to find an ally within that particular space. And in terms of allyship, then you it's not a guarantee that what you're pushing for, you'll be able to get it. People have had meetings with the particular committees of Parliament, and they've raised particular issues before them. And then once that is done, it's over. Then you're left with a huge task of doing a lot of lobbying, for example, with these parliamentarians who can be able to help you push for your agenda in Parliament. And that should not be the case. They're in place not because we are supposed to follow them, trying to ask them for what is supposed to be done for our sake. They're supposed to actually also take up the initiative to do it. For example, when you look at some of the laws which have been passed as a result of lobbying by civil society, and it took a lot of work and effort to be able for this to happen. So if that is going to be the route we'll be taking, then we're going to fail. We're not going to be achieving what we want to achieve, right? If, say, for example, we have a whole departmental committee which is tasked with dealing with issues of human rights in Parliament, what are they doing about it, right? When violations are occurring, you have to wait for the violation to occur for them to call for a sitting to be able to address these issues. What issues are being presented before the floor of Parliament, right? To say these particular issues are of growing concern to us, and want them to be addressed. Right? Once they get to Parliament, they sit pretty, and that's it.
Do you think it's a priority? Let's just be honest. When we talk about the different things, the different balls that are up in the air right now, do you think that when you look at the file at your in tray every morning as government, that human rights is on top of the tray?
Unfortunately, to them, it's not a priority. Clearly, it's not a priority. Because if it was a priority, with having people, both heads would be rolling in terms of accountability of human rights violators, right? I don't understand, for example, why we do not have a mass number of police officers being prosecuted right now for the violations which occurred in 2024. We do not, for example, if we talk about the Baby Pendo case, which has been in courts for over 5 years now.
Oh my God, Wallace, every day. We're not even talking about 2024, we're talking about every day. We're talking about when somebody goes to get a police abstract, for example, and a girl is asked to give sexual favors, to ask for a police abstract, or to ask for a P3 form. She's come from being violated by another party and is being asked to give sexual favors to get a P3 form, which is a free thing. What are we talking about? We're not even talking about one event. And that is my question. That we talk about everyday entrenched abrogation of these rights is taking place. So the question is, when do we get to the point where everybody then is on tenterhooks and you realize and say, you know what, we need to create a scenario so strong where everybody is aware, the perpetrators as well as the victims or would-be victims or would-be perpetrators, that everybody is so aware every day, all the time, that hold on a minute, we can't allow this to happen. When do we get to that point? The person who is arrested and asked to pay 200,000 shillings, who cannot afford 100 shillings to feed her children on that day, and is taken to court, and before you can say Jack's your uncle, she's thrown in the back of a truck. How many rights along those lines have been? What is the right of this individual to have a dustbin where she can actually throw that trash and didn't find one? Who asked those questions? And these are the little things that we talk about. We're not just talking about being beaten up in a protest. We're talking about things that happen on a daily basis for which rights are being abrogated. Can we get to the place that we are so saturated with this knowledge that everybody's on tenterhooks and will not allow a situation that we see? And these are the real issues, in my opinion.
No, I totally agree. And that's why I mentioned that when we look at when you look at and I agree, because we tend to look at the very big things that have actually happened for us to be able to, and that's actually in my notes, and I was telling my colleague earlier, we never appreciate the small things, and these small things will be violations themselves. When you actually add to juxtapose it with the right, it has been violated. And for me, as mentioned earlier, is a question of how do we now change the culture? Because this now has to change. And I'm glad we're having this conversation in this particular, in this particular time, in this particular space, because it is through such having these conversations that people actually now become aware of those who are not really aware about it, really. And then what we now need to push for is a change in culture. And it's very unfortunate that people usually are so suppressed that they actually, become accustomed to the suppression, accustomed to the violations. If you talk to a Kenyan right now, for example, and they come and tell you my right was violated, a fellow one will tell them, usijali, that usually happens, and that's how we brush it off. And nobody wants to actually, ensure that right which is violated is actually being redressed, right? So how do we change the culture? How do we, as a people ourselves, get to appreciate our rights, our freedoms, and call for accountability? It's also an issue of accountability as well. As mentioned earlier, nobody wants to be held accountable, even for the small things, right? If you take the example of the police station, this woman is assaulted at the police station. There's a commanding officer in that particular police station. That's the OCS. And report to the OCS. What do? They probably don't do anything about it. You escalate it to the probably OCPD. They don't do anything about it. You go all the way to the regional commander, to the county commissioner, because we have this culture of impunity all along the way, where people don't want to be held accountable, where people don't be responsible for their actions or misactions, right? So even if we have this conversation and all the key actors, including the citizenry, are not part of it, then you're going not to be going anywhere. Because that's what we need to do, right? We can have reviews. Kenyans come up for review, and like you asked earlier, what do? They sit at the back of the room and put their hands up, right? Unfortunately, you'll find reviews will come and then implement. They'll present a state report, and then recommendations will be made. They'll adopt quite a number of them. Last year, the last time Kenya was reviewed was in 2020, and they adopted at least over 100 recommendations from their peers, because a peer review mechanism.
Yeah.
But if you actually look at it, how have we implemented these particular recommendations? No, we haven't. Kenyans coming up for review again in 2025 in May. The same issues we've been talking about here will come up again in May. So it's a question of how do we now, all of us collectively, and for
start to deal
with it. We need to push for culture change. We need to push for accountability. We need to push for adequate information within the citizenry. We need to be able to have a change progressively. And I believe if the change may not be here and now, but if it comes, we will be able to have a different conversation where rights and freedoms are actually guaranteed and respected.
And one conversation that we cannot stop having, and we had it this morning, Wallace Nderu is a research and advocacy advisor with the Defenders Coalition. Kenya at a crossroads when it comes to human rights. Thank you for being here this morning.
This is The Situation Room, the only way to start your day.